Do subito la parola a John Akeroyd, il nostro ospite straniero, Cyber Research Honorary Research Fellow dell'University College of London. Prego John.
Buongiorno a tutti. Good morning. I now move to English. So thank you very much for the introduction, Nicola. My job this morning is to try and give you a very brief overview of the topic. I stressed to Anna a few weeks ago that this is not my area, this is not my expertise. I talk more about eBooks and so on than accessibility, but nevertheless it's an opportunity to provide you with a brief introduction and also talk a little bit about what's happening as I see it in the UK and to some extent the States. And then I'll hand on to people like Christina who are much more knowledgeable than I am about the topic, and then some practical sessions after the break. So, I thought we'd begin with, should I get the page down right? No. I thought we'd begin with some numbers, just to set the picture as to the problem we're addressing. And I think we're stressing here this morning, certainly in this session, disabilities associated with visual impairment. That is, people who are blind, people who are partially sighted, and people who are print impaired. Or by print impaired, it implies, I guess, things like dyslexia and inability to distinguish. And these are some numbers I picked up. As you can see, they don't necessarily keep these numbers very up to date, but there are reckoned to be in the UK almost 2 million people with some degree of sight loss. And of those, 218,000 with severe sight loss or blindness. My guess is the Italian figures percentage-wise are probably similar. And it's increasing. That's the important point. It tends to be age-related, so age-related macular and so on is rendering more people with these kind of problems. Add to that, well, just I suppose a point that I don't know if we're largely from the academic sector in the room, but from a public library perspective, clearly this is raising increasing challenges. So it's predicted to increase. I think the next slide, thank you, Nicola, shows the UK figures over the period to 2050. You can see how steep the rise will be to the levels of about 4 million by 2050. In the university sector, the figures I've collected there, again, this is worldwide, 285 million people, 39 million people blind, and 246 million with partial sight. So these are very large figures. And in UK universities, these were figures from about 4 years ago. There were reckoned to be 34,000 students, so enrolled students with some degree of visual impairment, and of those 30,000 with print impairment. And then finally, at the bottom there, some US figures. This is, I think, schools rather than universities, but 2.2% of the school population in effect with a visual disability. I've provided references. I imagine, Anna, you'll make the slides available. So if anybody wants wants to follow up on those, by all means, do so. So in terms of policy, and although I began with the UK legal framework, increasingly there's a kind of convergence and global convergence of policy around this issue. In the UK, predominantly we work on the Equalities Act of 2010, which is designed to protect people with disabilities from any kind of discrimination. And it creates the legal obligation on organisations to make what are termed, and it's always a point of contention, but what are termed reasonable adjustments to ensure that information and indeed other services are provided in an accessible format. So there's a legal obligation on universities and public libraries in the UK to make adjustments to avoid any kind of discrimination against those with visual impairment. The other relevant piece of legislation is the Copyright Act 2014, which puts forward some exceptions to copyright so as to enable those adjustments to be made, so that you can make a single copy of a copyright publication for personal use for someone who has a disability, visual disability. And it allows multiple copies to be made by authorised bodies, by universities, again to the same end. The other more global policy rather than legal framework I mentioned is the best practice guidelines. I've given you the URL for those. These were born out of some work, I think largely coming out of the UK a few years ago, and they're guidelines to publishers as to how they should operate in order to meet the obligations and help to deliver accessible content. And then more recently is what's termed, I think, the Marrakesh Treaty, and this again is trying to bring people together to provide or to deliver copyright treaties which allow I guess what the UK law is doing on a global basis. My other final point there, and I did before this presentation talk to one of the major publishers, Elsevier, and they were extremely helpful. They pointed me to one thing which I thought was worth mentioning, which is that within the Onyx metadata framework, I don't know if you know Onyx, I'm not going to talk about Onyx if you don't, but it's basically a bibliographic framework similar to MARC, but used by the publishing book trade. And within Onyx for books, they now have a code 196, which basically says this content is accessible. Now the idea is, and the hope is, that that will push on down the supply chain, so it potentially could get accommodated into MARC and so on, into the bibliographic record. So from the library and the library user perspective, you know that this material is accessible from another important development. Okay, just to, that's my first bit, move on to the second part. And what I tried to do, by training I should explain, I'm an engineer before I got into libraries. And so I look at things in process and diagrammatic form. I like diagrams, I like schemas. So I started to think about all of this and what does it actually look like if you stand back And right at the top is content. Whether you'd like, it's a useful way of describing content. Clearly, moving to a digital base is extraordinarily helpful for the partially sighted in ways which would otherwise have been very problematic. So, can you still see the screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay, just about. So I divided it down into content which is born digital, and this is increasingly the case. So even if it's not an e-book which has been developed to be an e-book, even most print books begin with a digital file. So publishers will now work from a Word file or whatever underlying technology they're using, but it will start digital before it's printed. But there is still clearly an awful lot, an awful lot of content which was always analogue, and essentially what comprises most libraries is analogue content. So thinking about the born digital, again it kind of forks into, still you are, you're well ahead of me, you know the presentation. It splits into born accessible. By born accessible we mean that the publisher has done all they can to make sure this file, this book, this e-product is accessible right from the outset, so nothing else needs to be done. Now that may be a very small component, I just don't know how much content is now born accessible, but it's an increase in ambition, so you really don't need to do anything further with that content. If it's not born accessible, then somehow you have to make it accessible, and that's the other fork in the tree. On the other side, just as it's not an afterthought, but it's a point, is that born analog also implies audio, and audio is becoming increasingly important, even in traditional publishing context. Next slide. So let's move on down further, and if something is born accessible, it implies it will be so formatted as to allow the technology that's used by the visually impaired and the blind to access that material. That implies it is formatted, structured, so as to allow the, let's say, the software to interpret it. It means that images are alternative text. It means paragraphs are identified, tables are identified, and so on. And I think I can probably say historically that DAISY has long been the format to enable that to happen as a global standard. PDF, you may not feel is accessible, and it isn't in its native form, but PDF can be made accessible. You can add structuring around it if you have the technology to allow you to do that, which implies it can then be rendered further on. The EPUB 3 is absolutely the latest, well, I suppose it's 2 years back now. The EPUB 3 has been built with accessibility, specified with accessibility in mind. So it's kind of borrowed a lot from the DAISY format. So if something is in EPUB 3, it gets towards being as good as we can in accessibility terms. Once the format is in place, then various software artifacts, systems are available to interpret that. It's essentially text-to-speech and reading applications, and then out onto the various devices. The devices themselves are improving in terms of accessibility. So even Microsoft and so on are doing increasingly more to help that. No, I'm still backwards. Sorry. So the other point there then is if that's okay, if it's more accessible, if you have to make it accessible, then you have to go through this process. And that implies you need a copy of the file to achieve that. And that can be the issue. So if you have a book in front of you, you want to make an accessible copy, you have to get hold of, or it would help to get hold of the underlying file, which implies approaching the publisher and asking the publisher for a copy of that file. And that can be a convoluted process to go through, but we'll look at that in a second. So next one, if something is not more digital, if it's more analog, then maybe the only possibility is to digitize it, to OCR it, to make a copy, machine-readable copy, and then try and make that accessible, but probably not as satisfactory as the alternatives. So then, next one, yes, thanks. So that kind of just brings that together. I think that says the same thing. And then next, please. The only other point I made there, is that clearly there are these copyright issues in terms of both digitisation and getting files and making them accessible. And this is where the legal framework comes in to allow that to happen. So this next and final section really is just about some tools that are out there to enable this kind of thing to happen. And firstly, the point about trying to get a file from a publisher in order to make it accessible. What's happened in the UK a few years ago now is that there was an attempt to provide a kind of directory of publishers, who to contact, how to get the file from the publisher. And that responsibility now rests with the RNIB, the Royal National Institute for the Blind. They have a publisher lookup system whereby you can simply go and key in what you're seeking. In the next one here, in the States they have something similar but much more sophisticated, the Access Text Network. And this works in a much more sophisticated way in that you can identify the publisher of the work that you're trying to get the machine-readable file from, and then it will automatically send a request to the publisher to make that provision. So it's a service that publishers sign up to, and it provides a kind of workflow between the library and the publisher, so that it becomes a much slicker and quicker process. And I think that's just an example of that that system in operation, so you can request it. This slide is another system which is from a company called Census Access. I think they're Scandinavian, and they've been selling this. It's a cloud-based system, so you can kind of plug it into your website or plug it into your library website or your student website. What it enables you to do is, if you have a machine-readable text of any kind on the left-hand side, so all of these file suffixes, you essentially upload it to their system. It then magically makes that file accessible, and over on the right-hand side pushes it out as a, well, you can see the different file formats that are available. So it's it's something that I think a number of UK universities have now adopted. So it makes, again, the process much easier. Once you've secured the file from a publisher, that conversion process into an accessible format. That, I think, is just a slide of the University of Kent library. So it's an academic library where they have adopted that piece of software, and you can see it resident in the library system. And then, yeah, my final two slides. The other thing I found, I'm aware of, is work that's been done by a group of, I think it's maybe 10 or 15 university libraries working together. So this isn't a kind of top-level project, it's just people who've got together to improve the accessibility, not so much the underlying content, but you also have to remember that if you're working within an eBOOK framework, for example, an eBOOK website, or any of the services that are being exhibited downstairs, there are challenges as to accessibility of the underlying search structure or the underlying system. So they set about looking at some of these systems using these kind of criteria to evaluate how good or bad they were in terms of accessibility. So what formats are supported? Do they support EPUB 3, for example? Issues to do with appearance, font and change font, navigation, how easy navigation is, how they interact with text-to-speech, readers, screen readers, access control, and whether images have alternative formats and so on. What they came up with, you can't read that, I guess, from where you are. But again, I don't know if I put the website on there, but you can look at this. It's a league table of various platforms, and it simply takes the scores that have been developed by the testers, adds those up, gives them a kind of weighting, and then it tells you which publisher is the best and which is the worst. So it's slightly the English phrase of naming and shaming. So you can write at the top, you can't read, but right at the top it says Vital Source, which is an eBook service from Ingram, I think it is. I think
from ProQuest.
it's ProQuest is number 2, is it? Okay. And
Credo reference.
Credo, Elsevier number 4, Cambridge, Taylor and Francis, and so on. I won't read the ones that are at the bottom, but over there. So it's just a way of trying to make people aware, make publishers aware. Look, your website has got your service has got these kind of problems. Why don't you think about it? And so, if you can get some of these people to get further up towards there, it's all helping to improve the accessibility. So that's all I wanted to cover off. Nicola?
Yeah, thank you.
Is it overdue now?
Yeah, thank you, John.
Thank you.